Welcome to the LB's The Lover of Books Author Chat. If this is your first time live or watching a recording, I just want to say welcome, welcome, welcome. Make sure you click subscribe on my channel, the LB's The Lover of Books. I have 41 recorded author chats posted there with over 7,300 hours watched. So I'm betting you have already read some of these books and can go back and watch and see what the author has to say. Leave me a comment and let me know what you think. Now I want to introduce you to this amazing, amazing debut author who is dialing in from Italy. And that is 2 a.m. her time. So this is dedication, people. She is ready to go. I'm so excited about it. She is a Caribbean American writer currently based in Italy. Her debut novel, Black Cake, is a New York Times bestseller, a Read with Jenna book club pick, and inspiration for the Hulu screen series produced by Oprah Winfrey's Harpo Studios. This was one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2022, and also one of Oprah's daily best books of 2022. It's been featured in New York Times, Washington Post, Cosmo, Glamour, Good Housekeeping, Marie Claire, Essence Parade, People Magazine, W, InStyle, BBC. Y'all, the list goes on and on. This book is just so awesome. CHARMAINE was a former U.S. news and communications professional whose award-winning short fiction has also appeared in various anthologies and magazines. Please welcome CHARMAINE Wilkerson. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so impressed that you're still awake and you look like you just woke up. So I'm like, wow. How are you doing tonight?
Hello, Laura Beth. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and hello, everyone. It's amazing to see that people are joining from all over, and that's very exciting.
It is exciting.
The eyeglasses help me to look as though I'm more awake, but it's only for reading the screen. I've got to take them off.
You're totally fine. Well, I know that you mentioned in your author's note that everyone's a storyteller in some form or fashion, but I'd like to know what led you down the path of this type of storytelling.
I was one of those little girls who loved to read books, and I used to swipe books from my parents' bookshelves. Probably not a good idea considering the range of books they had, but I loved reading. And there were people in my childhood who would sort of sit and tell the children's stories. And so it's always been part of my life. And I only know that I wanted to write stories. And when I was a little girl, I would. But fast forward to adulthood, and I went into journalism. And later, as you mentioned, other forms of communication. So the great thing about that is I've had the privilege of having to read and write and tell stories in a way all my professional life. But what I do now is completely different. And Laura Beth, I think the thing that I have to say is that I sensed whatever I wrote, I sensed that I wanted to write in a different way. And fiction in particular is kind of strange that way. In theory, we invent characters and make up scenarios, but I feel that fiction is a way in which we can get closer to the truth sometimes, because the truth of our lives is often residing in the gray areas, the morally wobbly areas, the questions that don't have answers. You know, I write a lot about relationships and feelings, emotions. And so I felt that need, and I finally decided I had to do this on a regular basis.
What did it feel like going from journalism based in fact, history, you're giving those details, to shifting gears with your brain to going into that, fiction land where you can now manipulate what you want it to be?
Well, I felt more like myself, actually. I've always sensed that I wanted to do that because, again, you get to explore. It's my way of processing the world around me. It's my way of thinking about relationships and again, asking questions. I don't have any of the answers, but that's what we do with our lives often. So it was very interesting, and I found I sort of had to divorce myself from what I now call my day jobbing, because, you know, really everything that I've done until now has involved beginning with the research. That research might be reading data studies, it might be going to a news conference, it might be sitting down with an expert and asking what we need to produce together. Once I was working behind the scenes, but it was always about the research first, the questions first that needed to be answered, deciding how you would write something, outlining everything, and working with someone else along the way. Now, what I do is I just go, I just write what comes to mind, and then I take a look at where I'm going and I think about it. And then I do the research. So, not all fiction writers are that way, but that's my approach.
Well, it almost sounds therapeutic, like you're releasing yourself into this new process, and with that comes your voice. Did you find that like it was that a feeling of freedom in a way to be able to express yourself like that?
I think that writing in any form, whether it is fiction or memoir or poetry, can be a very freeing process because you're doing something different with your brain and with your heart. Even if you've outlined, at some point you can say you're leading the story, but really what you're doing is you're following your thoughts, you're following ideas. And in my case, if I start to build a character and I see a character, at a certain point I'm following the character. I'm not sure of everything that the character will do or say, even when I see the whole story in my head.
Now, this is personal in a lot of ways because you're talking about your culture, your family to a certain extent. You talked about in the author's note that some of it was based loosely on stories and family members. Was it easier or harder to write knowing that it was going to be of a personal nature?
Well, it came to me easily. These were just ideas that came to me. So I should be very clear about that. I steal ideas like this. My mother made a legendary black cake. So I knew something about the process of soaking fruits for the cake. I knew what it was like to know someone who was practically obsessed with making that cake, which plays a role in the plot of my novel Black Cake. I had both of my parents, my biological parents, were open water swimmers. So I knew that it was possible for a young woman to be swimming in the sea, even if most people didn't do that in a certain period in the Caribbean. But I was not writing about my family. This is not an autobiographical tale. I'm not telling the story of something that happened to someone. And so I didn't think of it as being something that would put me in a position of revealing family secrets or private details. And that might be difficult for people to imagine because this story deals with two American-born siblings who discover that their Caribbean-born mother had a hidden past. And I'm an American-born person, born to two parents who grew up in the Caribbean. But really, we're not talking about an autobiographical story.
I would say it's a compliment if people believe that because it just resonated and it reads like reality. So I think kudos to you if people are fooled into believing it is a memoir. I know that wasn't your intention, but it is a beautiful story. I think one of the things that impressed me so much was this in between state that so much of the people are the characters, the locations, just that, you know, ebb and flow that happens for them. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems to be a major theme throughout.
So when you say the in-between state, excuse me, when you say the in-between state or the ebb and flow, what exactly do you mean, Laura?
I mean, for instance, Benny, she never quite feels like she belongs. You know, is she white? Is she black? Is she Californian? Is she a Caribbean? Is she American? Same thing with Marble, the Italian and UK, and then just the skin color. I know Byron even has some conflict there with Californian and versus, just that identity of where do I fit in and am I ever really going to be accepted? Because I am so in between.
So now I see what you mean. And yes, you know, in that respect, I would say that the thinking that went into this fictional tale reflects a lot of what I see in my world. So I come from a multicultural, multicolored family where probably very few of us over 2, 3 generations have had the same upbringing. We don't all look alike. I live in a country where I have 0 cultural ties. I have no cultural background here to my knowledge, but I happen to be here. I'm living my life in someone else's language, like a lot of people in the world, but it's something I did later in my adult life. So I do a lot of thinking about identity, and I'm fascinated by other influences on our identity. And one of those is the power of story to shape the ways in which we see ourselves, our relationships, our families, and what happens when some stories are not told and then they're revealed, as in this novel. But essentially, I'm fascinated by the ways in which our ideas of self, family, and home can shift. They can shift over time, or they can flip back and forth depending on the context. So you touched on that very important point. There are a number of characters in the book who I feel that for the most part, they feel pretty comfortable with who they believe themselves to be, meaning they take themselves for granted, but they're constantly struggling against the expectations and stereotypes and pressures of other people or the world around them. And Benny is the extreme example of that. Benny has never really questioned who she is at the core or whether she needs to be someone different. She's just constantly feeling not accepted as she is. And so as she changes her mind about things, or for example, she begins one school, then she begins another, she has her reasons, but she feels misunderstood. And that brings us to the heart of another element in this story. There's a lot of miscommunication. There are all of these stories that people are not telling one another. And so they don't understand one another. And so they misunderstand one another. And that creates some of the drama, at least in the present day of the story.
It is how we find out how you timed giving us information really heartbreaking because of that miscommunication. Because what they believe is, I'm not loved, or I'm not being cared for or understood. But in reality, or they're angry, and they just don't have all the pieces to fit it together. Like when Benny cannot get out of the vehicle at the funeral, or Gibbs, I'm sorry, not Gibbs, the dad, I can't think of the name, showing up in New York and just watching his daughter because he misses her so much, and her having no idea that those paths not really crossing. It's heartbreaking because if they just knew and would communicate, it's totally different.
Exactly. And there's this intergenerational thing. This is something I did think about when I wrote, all of us when we're younger, especially adolescents, we're thinking, oh, my parents don't understand me. They've never been through this. My generation is different. But often we don't stop to think about our parents. Maybe when we get older, but even then, it's difficult for us to imagine that our parents would have gone through some of those emotional shifts that we went through. We might hear about the big dramas. Many of us are born to parents who've been through some pretty big dramas, or may lived through war, or had to move, or had illnesses or losses. But often we don't hear about the things that really help to shape their sense of identity, the ways in which they parent. And so I sort of play with that in this story. You've got the kids who don't really know anything about their parents, so they can't imagine. And you have the parents who are sure that, for example, Benny is motivated by a kind of selfishness or stubbornness without fully understanding what she's been through. But why? Because she hasn't told them.
Mhm. Yeah, I found her character extremely fascinating because it was just so intricate. I mean, it builds, and you do see her in the beginning as a very selfish person until she opens up and we get her dialogue. I do want to talk a little bit about Eleanor though, because she does hold so much so close to her chest. Why do you think, I know you talk a little bit about it in the story, but why go through all of this in the end the way she did with the recordings through the attorney? Not allowing anybody to know anything, but at the end, what was the reasoning behind that?
Well, in the beginning, she was trying to protect herself.
Mhm.
Then she was trying to protect her family. Later, there was an element of shame, not wanting to reveal some of what she'd gone through because she wasn't sure how she'd be accepted. But in the end, when you talk about the fact that she's now a senior citizen, she knows that there's a good chance she's not going to survive, and she records that message. The reason goes back to the rift in their family. She keeps waiting for Benny to come home, and Benny has not come home, and she feels she needs to tell her two children in California what she wants to communicate. She needs to tell them in person or together, and she feels she'll never see her daughter and her son together again. And so she starts to record the messages.
Do you find that one of these characters was harder or easier to write? Because you talk about the different generations. You have Benny, and even they're pretty far in age apart. So I don't know that I would even classify them the same. So how did you deal with that? Those age gaps and perspective,
So by Benny, you're thinking like Benny and Byron, there are 9 years between them,
right?
and
Plus
they're
you have
very
Eleanor,
different.
plus you have Bunny, plus you have Johnny Lynn Cook. I mean, you have it's a generational story.
Well, I wrote primarily from the heart. So I was writing a number of scenes. Some of them seemed connected, but I thought others were just stories. And then I began to see that they were living part of the same bigger story. Um, I just wrote them by imagining what that would feel like. And I'm writing mostly from an emotional point of reference, but it is imagined. There's no guarantee that we do imagine stories and we try to put ourselves in other people's shoes, but maybe I can only put myself in one shoe and not the other. And I
Mhm,
think that is part of the challenge of writing, but also the hat trick,
mhm.
of writing. You try to get close to the heart, but you may not have all of the details. I did a lot of research for more specific details, and some of the emotional. With Benny, for example, I found myself double checking articles on domestic violence specifically, because the one scene that's explicit of domestic violence is actually pretty standard, right? But I kind of wanted to go back to a very basic classic scenario, but I was double checking the research. I said there was a research about this, that women, women, a certain kind of woman was most likely to experience domestic violence compared to other people. And, so I would do the research. With Byron, I did quite a bit of research on ocean science. I put very little detail in, but I was reading research on exactly why, even when we encourage, for example, um, young people of color or young girls or young women to go into STEM studies and work, meaning, science and technology, that there would be a certain drop off. And why was that happening? So I just did a lot of research and then just tried to use that to bolster what was coming to me through my imagination and through emotional channels.
Did you have a favorite character when you were writing it, or is it hard to say?
Oh, yeah, it's definitely hard to say. I like all of my characters. And I think maybe the thing that might surprise people is I'm most curious about the character who is the least developed, meaning I leave him just as he is. But I think, how would he get to be the way he was? I don't think it's that simple. I'm talking about Little Man. the
Mhm.
one they murder. And I have a soft spot for the person who many people are very upset with him, and that's Lynn. I have a soft spot for Lynn because I think I liked writing that character because he causes such distress for so many people,
Mhm.
but it's not that simple. You know, he's in denial. He's causing a lot of the trouble. But he basically has a generous heart. He thinks he's doing the best thing he can for his family. And if he knows he's not sure how to do it differently. So I, as a writer, enjoyed that because I liked dealing in those gray areas and trying to show empathy, not pity, but just empathy. And often empathy takes us to a point where we do not have the answers. That's what I like about fiction. You know, in my life, I don't know about you, but I'm as impatient and intolerant as the next person. You know, if I hear something I don't like, I don't want to hear it. You know, but in fiction, I'm curious. I want to say, why would a person do that? Or you know, how do you get there? Because in life, we find ourselves in situations and we don't even know why sometimes. Or we're quick to judge someone or quick to doubt someone, and we don't know the half of it.
Well, and I do love that he had such a swing. I mean, he was left for so much of the book on that beach, basically, yearning for his daughter to show back up. And we don't really pick up with him again until, at the end. And so we do see that his life has changed dramatically and that he could have reached out to his daughter, but I think he felt that that was selfish on his part, that he wanted to leave that if she wanted to find him. And so to me, that did give me some empathy for him. I mean, I understand Byron's reaction, but I think because that was a selfless act as a father to not try to, make Covey brought back into his world without her choosing that.
And maybe some of it is, you know, like any one of us, we don't want to be rejected, right?
True.
So that too, what if he had tried? What if
Yeah.
he had tried?
Yeah. There's definitely has to be some fear there. I do want to talk a little bit about the idea of foreigners and the expectation of children of foreigners to reach a certain goal or have certain expectations of them, because that was a theme I thought that you had brought up, is that the need for the children to be perfect sometimes, accomplished. And I think it's not just for the Black heritage but also just immigrants in general. So can you talk a little bit about that theme for us?
Yes, you know, you hit on that. I mean, obviously, all parents, I say all, I shouldn't speak for all parents, but we know that parents want their children to do well. We know they tend to want a minimum of trouble for them, and they may be disappointed if things aren't going the way they hope. But I think with children of people who came from other countries, especially to the United States, they want to know that everything they've gone through to get there is going to be worth something. They also feel that excellence and achievement can help to protect their children. I mean, that's my take on it. Certainly, that's what Byron and Benny's parents are going through. Byron and Benny's parents are smart people who did pretty well and worked hard, and they expect their children to do the same. And they recognize that they're fortunate because they recognize that their children are, you know, learn pretty easily and learn well. And so they want them to use that to protect themselves by achieving through work, through education. Benny keeps bouncing around. She's having difficulties. They don't know why, but they do recognize that if she applies herself, she does very well.
Do you think that her parents devalue a degree in the arts in comparison to STEM like Byron?
Definitely in the Bennett family, there's a sense that, you know, if you have a profession that has a certificate or a degree or something that makes sense to them, that they can recognize, and something that will guarantee a certain level of income, then they're going to feel more secure with that. And they see a daughter who goes to a prestigious university and drops out without explaining. Then she goes abroad and studies culinary arts. Then she talks about maybe opening a cafe, but does not appear to have a lot of wealth to do so. So they're perplexed. And then, of course, there are other dimensions in her life that begin to, make them feel, they just sort of feel that everything she's doing is leading her down a road in which she's not going to be safe. She's not going to be protected. They can't guarantee her well-being.
Can you talk a little bit then about why her mother put restrictions on the money that she gave her? Because it sounded to me that her inheritance had to be used for the cafe, which is a complete turnaround, right? From the situation prior, when I guess when her husband died, or even after that.
So her mother doesn't really put restrictions on it, but it's something that I think, the scenes in the book don't talk about this, but there's clearly an evolution of feeling. And the mother gets to the point where I think she just wants her daughter to do well. And she's learned something about why her daughter left college and what's going on and her insecurity. And she begins to connect that with her own past, in which she had to make decisions that other people might not understand. And we know she's kept secrets from her own husband as well. So she didn't really restrict that, but she was certainly opening the door to that possibility at the end of her life.
I want to talk a little bit about the oldest daughter because we haven't really talked about Marble. First of all, why did she give her baby her mother's name, Matilda? Because in her mind, she has no idea why her mom left her, why her mom didn't come back and get her. There's a lot of just doubt there, but yet she still values that name and gives it to her firstborn.
So that's the biggest why in the book, right? If someone has gone away and not come back, why in the world would we name our child after that person? But the fact is, they had a loving relationship. Her mother, Matilda, was the one who taught Covey to swim in rough water. She was the one who instilled in her a bit of that personality in which she at times would defy her father, but sort of gave her a sense that there were possibilities, that she could be strong enough to overcome things. And part of that comes from that visceral relationship that she has with the natural world. She's learned to swim in rough water. She's learned to swim distance. And that transfers itself to her personality to some extent. She loved her mom and she missed her mom and she doesn't know what happened and she feels abandoned, but you don't undo love. You maybe layer hurt or perplexity or doubt on top of love, but we don't undo love. I mean, anyone who's ever been in a relationship that ended, say, a romantic relationship, anyone who stopped talking to someone they loved, as Benny and Byron do for years, they haven't necessarily undone the love.
I thought it was just fascinating that, she had to leave her daughter. Matilda had to leave Covey, and then now Covey's having to leave Matilda. And I thought that was very, round circle, it just came right back around because that love was always there, as we find out later on. But it just, it was a very touching story. And I loved when you talked about the strength that her mother taught her. And I think her father realizes this when he talks about the driftwood, and that story that you told about people taking it piece by piece and putting it. Can you talk a little bit about those metaphors throughout the book? Because I loved that, may have been my favorite one.
So you're thinking about the line that is, the beauty of a thing justified its plunder.
Yes.
So we see that line a couple of times in the book. We first see this line, the beauty of a thing justified its blunder. It's Lynn, the father in the past, thinking wryly about life. And he thinks first of driftwood. There's this huge fallen tree that's become a piece of driftwood. It's bleached, it's been there for years, but every once in a while, a piece of it disappears because someone wants a piece of it, because it's beautiful, because they want to take a piece home with them.
Mhm.
So first, he sort of wryly thinks the beauty of a thing justified its plunder, meaning it's so beautiful, I want a piece, I'm taking it. But then he transfers that in a darker way to the threats to his own daughter, the idea that a young woman and the challenges she's facing, and ultimately the fact that little man had made a decision that he wanted to marry her. So it's an idea of taking something because you see it,
Yeah.
taking a piece of beauty, whether that's the natural world or a piece of art or the light or pleasure that a person brings.
A lot of your novel did talk about the natural world, whether it be the ocean floor or even with Ellie with her love of the earth. Um, Talk about that because I just found that fascinating that they didn't really push Byron into this field, but he just so naturally flowed into it, almost an homage, I feel like, to Ellie.
Well, Byron is a California boy. He grew up surfing and swimming and on the Pacific coast. And for whatever reason, his interest in science takes him toward ocean sciences. And his specialty is remote sensing. So when his parents joke that he listens to the sea for a living, it's pretty much true, but obviously with all sorts of gadgets and science. And that happens naturally. We don't see Benny swimming or surfing, but she too has learned that. And their parents were attached to the sea. They were swimmers. And you mentioned Ellie. Yes, she loves to dig in the dirt and she puts her hands in the dirt and she eats dirt. Now we know that's that's not being connected to the earth. We know that that's a nutritional thing. But the point is that we see that character as well. And that just came to me naturally as, I just imagined these um, people as, again, that's another thing that can have a stamp on your identity. In this book, I think there are people who have strong emotions and they're spiritual in a way, but the way in which we see that spirituality manifest itself is in this physical connection to the earth in which, the planet on which they live. So there's water, there's earth, and the relationship that these individuals have to the natural world um, helps to put a stamp on their identity and helps to build character. And it's just something that in this book, the characters seem different, but they actually have a lot of things in common.
Yeah, I mean, even Bunny there. I mean, it was a neat connection between those two. You mentioned Ellie digging in the ground, and we know what she found. We thought at first it was trinkets, right? But we learned that it's much more valuable. But Eleanor says something that was interesting. Says things are just things. Do you think she really believed that? Because she held on to these items for a really long time, and it was so important that she held on to them, not only for B&B, but also for Matilda. So do you think that how do you think, where do you fall on this one?
Well, that's one of those areas that you can explore through fiction because there isn't really an answer. You have people who, in theory, are their biggest struggles are existential. It's emotion, relationships, identity, but in a way, a few of them have obsessions with things. So Ellie collects these trinkets at a certain point in her life. Ellie, the orphan, that is. At a certain point, she realizes that she has a destiny, that she has this connection to the earth, and everything else is just material. But she still holds on to that. And then Eleanor picks that up and carries that. Eleanor, the mother of Byron and Benny, is obsessed with her black cake. She's got to store the fruits and soak them and make the cake. And she feels that this is a part of her heritage she's trying to pass down to her children.
You
that
should
it's
have
just a
Byron go back
cake.
in that house during the
Yeah,
earthquake. Get
I
that free.
just had fun with that one. It just came out, but I had fun with that one.
Where do
Um,
you land on, is black cake a colonizer's cake? Or, you know what I mean? There was a big discussion on where things belong, or is it a shared item? I found that fascinating because there was no definitive answer, right? It's more thought process, but I just wanted to hear your brain on this.
yeah, so when I wrote a book called Black Cake, but I did not set out to write a story about a cake or with a cake in it. But since I was writing about people in the Caribbean in the past, it was natural that that cake would come up because it's popular in a number of different countries. In fact, my mother, who made one, she didn't call it black cake. She called it plum pudding. I call it rum cake or Christmas cake, popular for the year-end holidays and weddings mostly. So going back to that idea of the history of the cake, it's essentially an English plum pudding that's evolved, no longer uses brandy, but uses rum and dark brown cane sugar, which we associate with the Caribbean, but actually sugar cane comes from elsewhere. So I think that it's once the cake popped up in the story, I saw its potential in the plot, but also saw it as a symbol of everything that's happening to the people in this story. It's good and bad. You can't separate out the good things that happen to you from the bad things that happen to you. And the cake is like that. If you ask someone of my generation who knows this cake, who has a Caribbean culture, if they like the cake, it's all positive. It's family, it's togetherness, it's celebration, it's tradition. But it's a symbol of what is at the heart of this novel, and that is the power of stories to shape our identities, whether those stories are told or not told. In the case of Byron and Benny, their mother's secrets were never told. Now what happens? What does this say about who they are when the story changes? The black cake sort of symbolizes that idea because it's not a secret, but no one sits around talking about the fact that you couldn't have a black cake if there hadn't been, colonialism, if there hadn't been a thriving, I want to say industry, but that's the wrong word, a thriving monocropping economy of, sugarcane. You grow sugarcane, you get sugar and rum from that. And that was wildly popular. It made a lot of people wealthy. It created traditions that we have to this day. But that was not possible without forced labor. So you have colonialism, you have forced labor, AKA slavery or indentured servitude. And then you have modern day cultures that cannot fully separate themselves out or separate themselves from the past that might not be ideal to them. So you're really talking about Mabel, or Marble, as she calls herself, when we talk about that story. She's the one who claims that the black cake cannot really be a Caribbean tradition because it hasn't been around that many centuries and it came from somewhere else. But her argument, I think, could be considered weak because how do you know where one culture begins and another ends, as someone says in the book? How do you know? Cultures evolve for better and for worse. They evolve from certain forces. So I would say that I'm right in the middle there. I think the black cake is a Caribbean cake. But you can't pretend it didn't come from somewhere else. And do we need to pretend? Do we? I'm fascinated by what happens in our society when we hear new information, when we're taught one thing and then we hear new things and we're not comfortable. So you can argue about whether it's solid information or whether it needs to be researched, but this is well known. And sometimes we hear things we don't like, and we don't know what that's telling us about ourselves. That's what happens to Byron and Benny in their family dilemma. And the black cake is kind of a rubbery reflection of that idea.
I'd
Where does the
almost,
good stuff? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'd almost want to hear what Marble's thoughts on it was after she found out everything, right? Because her opinions on Black Cake came before she knew of her mother, before she knew of her brother and sister, before she'd been in that house and saw the cake and smelled it. You know what I mean? I think it, I think that's part of that transition you're talking about. Now she's received new information. Would she even change? So it's just interesting to think of that progress or or I don't know, transformation really.
Yes, and of course, she's coming at it from a point of view where she has set certain parameters for the ways in which she will define food because she's considered kind of a food expert. So
Mm.
that's fine. That might not change, but I too wonder, I think her attitude might soften, but in Black Cake, it might seem as though a lot of things are wrapped up, but in fact, at the end of the story, the reader knows more than Byron and Benny do, and Marble as well. And we don't really know what will happen to certain relationships, what will happen to Marble, and what will happen to Lynn, and more importantly, what will happen to Etta. So there's a TV series, and that addresses some of those questions a little differently because you always have an adaptation, and that varies. But in the book, you don't know what's going to happen next.
All right. I think we may have some readers that have some questions for you, but while they are thinking of them, trying to process, I'm going to ask you some rapid fire questions. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
just come at it. What do you
Okay.
think your best island dish?
Oh, it's something that's not in the book.
Okay.
Ackee and saltfish, which ackee is a fruit that grows on the island of Jamaica, and it is combined with salted codfish and other stuff.
Yum. That sounds so good. Sand or sea?
Sand.
Swimming or surfing?
Swimming.
Island or mainland?
Mainland coast.
Okay. US or the UK cover of Black Cake?
Oh, that's not a fair question. Here's my answer. Okay, you need an answer. Here's my answer.
I love it. They're both beautiful. They really are. I don't know how you would choose. They're just so pretty. Do you prefer hard or paperback?
Hardcover.
And do you have a favorite recipe book?
My favorite recipe book is missing its cover and pages, and it's a book that was done as a fundraiser in Connecticut, of all places, where I used to live. And it's just recipes from people who are known in the community. And they put together this book and used it as a fundraiser. And it has some of my favorite recipes to this day.
Do you remember about what year that would be in case we have anybody from Connecticut here?
Oh my goodness. I know there's someone from Connecticut because I saw someone's name pop up. No, we're talking about a long time ago. It's a gift my brother gave me. And I want to say that it was in the late 1980s, but I think they did the book before and they also did the book after.
Wonderful. Well, I think we have some people ready to ask questions. Does anybody want to raise their hand? If not, I see some questions I can ask. Yes, Mary Ann, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you here. Go ahead and unmute, and you can ask your question.
Great. Thank you, Charmaine. It's so wonderful to hear you this evening. Certainly enjoyed reading Black Cake. My question for you is about your choice in the way you structured the book and these short, almost flash fiction like chapters with alternating POVs. If you could just speak to that a bit, I'd love to hear about your process. Thank you.
Hello, Marianne, and thank you for that question. I'm delighted that you use the phrase flash fiction because a lot of readers are not familiar with that term. It's simply a very short story. So some people call it short. But if you can think of a poem that is beautifully written and that might only take up a page. There are stories that only take up a page or half a page. And I was writing these stories several years ago, and I thought, oh, is there something, why do my stories end? You know, they're so short. And then I discovered there was a whole world of people writing these stories. I also noticed that in some of the novels I'd written, every once in a while I'd see a chapter that was just a paragraph or half a page. And when I was writing, this would come naturally to me. It still does, you know, and it's funny because I'm a very wordy person. I'm very chatty, but when I write, often I love stories that will just drop you into the middle of a scene and then jump out, but you still have a sense of beginning, middle, and end. So again, to get to the heart of your question, Marianne, I just write that way naturally. In fact, my publishers, I think it's all right for me to say this, my amazing, wonderful, brilliant publishers in the US and the UK at one point said, oh, we love the short chapters. It's great. But, you know, maybe you could stay for a little while longer with a character because we're curious. Whatever you want to do, you know, however you want to do that, you can do that. But think about that. And so if you see any chapters that are a little longer, that's me pulling one chapter from here and there and putting it together.
I see. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm a psychologist, and so I'm always really curious about memory and how we form memories. And I think that's part of why I sort of love this like flash fiction structure. And that's kind of how we remember things, right? I mean, we don't remember things typically in these like fully formed stories with beginnings and ends and middles. You know, we often remember just the core aspect of it, right? The most emotive piece of it. And so I just loved it. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And thanks to you, I love hearing an expert in these things make that comment, because it's not only how we remember, it's sort of like a dream. One flash fiction master, by master, I mean certain people who write the most beautiful fiction of this kind, referred to it as being kind of like a dream state, you know, snippets of dreams. And yet somehow we understand that. But I think conversations are that way. You know, we tell them in snippets and we still understand one another.
And in big families, we're constantly interrupting. So that's the other, I think that's the other way in which we got to get those snippets right.
Yeah.
Great question, Marianne. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marianne.
Of course.
All right. Does anybody else want to ask a live question? If not, I will ask one more just as a follow-up with Marianne. One of your chapters was written as poetry, the How to Become a College Dropout. So why did you choose that? Because it's a little bit on the same line as what she asked, but I still feel like even a little bit more of a tangent.
So at the risk of sounding like someone who does not, you know, think about what she's writing, I really do, but I'm a write first, ask questions later kind of person. And at a certain point, I just thought, they don't know anything about Benny. How does she tell them? And I didn't even think of it as a poem. I thought it's a list, how to become a college dropout. And I just thought list, you know, and so mentally it's 1, 2, 3, 4. But then I went back and wrote it so that it had a sort of rhythm to it. At least when I read it, it feels as though there's a kind of rhythm. And some lines were a little longer, some a little shorter. But it just came to me. And I decided that was it. It would be a chapter.
Well, for me, I think that so many times people aren't paying attention to Benny. And this change of pace and this rhythm really made me as a reader stop and listen to this and gave it perspective, because it wasn't part of your normal speed. You know, it did change. And so I thought that was a fascinating way to really put a spotlight on her reasoning for what she was doing. I also want to put a spotlight on Rael Lynn, who wrote this beautiful comment that I want to share with you. It says, I'm a descendant of a Chinese migrant to Jamaica. Black Cake was the first time I saw myself and my family in a novel. that is just, Raquel, thank you for sharing that with us, first of all. And if you do want to speak up, please do. But I would, Raquel, I see you came unmuted. Do you want to talk? Okay.
Sure.
Hello.
It was fantastic. Now I know how a lot of other people feel. I saw Jamaica pre-colonial, pre-independence, like how I imagined my parents meeting each other, and it was great. It was great. My grandfather, who was Chinese, was also a Mr. Lin, so I was gobbling up everything I had about Lin as well. Thank you so much. And yes, keep telling more stories, because your perspective is really, we need more. We need more like you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Raquel. That was very thoughtful of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for sharing, Raquel. I loved it. All right, we have a question here from Eileen. Did you help cast the movie or the series for Hulu? And tell us about that process. What was your involvement?
So I consider the series to be someone else's creation. And, you know, that sort of thing was decided ahead of time in conversation. And that was fine with me because I was publishing my first novel and not really sure how that would work, because it was going to come out during the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, and I was in Italy. So I thought, that's enough. I want to be involved. I don't want to write the script, and it's someone else's creation. They have the vision. So going back to your question, I was an executive producer, which is a fancy way of saying I wrote the book. And it also means that I was a kind of consultant. So people would, you know, write to me with questions about research, or, you know, tell us about this area, tell us more about Byron's profession, what about the house, what about the costumes, what about, you know, some social phenomena. In terms of casting, no, the casting was taking place in its own world. Someone did write to me with a question about casting, but it wasn't a question about, is it all right if we cast that actor? It was a question about, if the actor is not exactly the way you describe that character in the book, is that all right? And I thought that was an interesting question, and I appreciated it. But, you know, again, when you do something like this, it's a combination of technique, method, research, and a kind of a hat trick. You create an illusion. You know, Benny, you may have noticed that Benny, Byron, and Marble in the book are all very large people. They're tall, and they also have, you know, good, robust bodies. And the person who plays Benny is tiny. She's the Tony Award-winning actress Adrienne Warren, who played Tina Turner on Broadway and worked with Tina Turner to study for that role. And she's tiny. And I didn't even bat an eye when I saw her. I was delighted that she was playing that role. So it's interesting to see the contrast. Yeah. And that's what they were asking about, not about Adrienne, but about another character and you know, whether it would work.
Well, Erica would like to know, first she says, I love the audiobook. Did you get to pick the narrator, and how does this work?
Well,
I love the audiobook.
It's interesting because the truth is, they ask you about everything. They really do. And so with the audiobook, essentially they sent a few names and samples of the voices and asked me to comment on the various ones. And then based on that, they saw who was available and who could work together. So let me just make a plug for the audiobook actresses. It's interesting because now I didn't want to read my book, but if I were to read my book, it would be different because I have a different personality, because I like contemporary fiction. I like the edge of the narrator's voice. But there were two women, one American, one British, both of Jamaican parentage, who created this world of all of these characters. And I thought they were brilliant. One is Lynette Freeman, the American, and the other is Simone McIntyre, the British actress. Two actresses did all of those voices and created this world. So again, there's a pool. Obviously, they're vetted already, and then they're presented, at least in my case, to me as the author, and they say, what do you think? But the rest, you know, is their choice. They have a director, they make their own interpretations, and that's the beauty of working with different media.
Well, there is lots of love for this book, and I know everybody wants to know if you can tell us what you're working on next.
So I am I'm finishing up another novel, and it's very different from Black Cake. It'll be interesting to see how people who enjoyed Black Cake feel about this, and whether people who might like this book, you know, liked Black Cake. It is, however, another multi-generational story. It is a family drama. And again, it toys with the idea, as I seem to do in all my writing, of identity, you know, especially for people like me who are people who identify as people of color. Often people think that when we talk about identity, that it's going to necessarily and only relate to something you can see. So I identify as a woman, I identify as a person of color, and you think, oh yeah, well, so that's your identity, maybe your profession, maybe where you were born. I am fascinated by the things that stamp our identities, like the stories we're told or not told, as I mentioned before, Laura Beth, the foods that we, you know, the recipes we inherited, the objects we inherited, the everyday habits, and of course, place, always place. So I always toy with that, and I do this in my next book. That's all I can say for now.
Do you have any idea timing wise for us, or just so we know when to look?
Yeah, so it's not official, but definitely we're looking at, you know, maybe early next year, you know,
Okay.
end of the year. So still
All right.
some work to be done.
Well, also, I would like to know what books you would recommend for all of these awesome readers here, what you've been reading, or maybe, you know, something coming up.
Oh, so many. So let me try to be really, really fast. Do we have a minute? Let me name something that I've just read. I'll name two books that I've just read that I loved. They're by men. One is The Covenant of Water, big, long, by Abraham Verghese. I think he calls himself Verghese. And the other is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. A book that I absolutely loved, and it does deal with Caribbean themes, has very lyrical language, but ultimately is about relationships and family and so forth, is called When We Were Birds, and it's by Ayana Lloyd Banwo. Another book along those lines, but I would say maybe more contemporary, brilliant language, but less lyrical, is a book called If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery. He's Jamaican, and that book was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. A book that goes way back, two books from the past that I love. Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club, which is about mothers and daughters in the past and the present, and Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel, again, an older book, which toys with the language of food and what food can mean and how it affects emotions and vice versa. So those are all sorts of things all over the place, but they are books I've loved from the recent past and the long ago past.
I could see people writing quickly. So thank you so much for those. And thank you, Charmaine, for coming. I know this is extremely late, and we are just so appreciative of your time. I could have talked for you for another hour, but I don't know how 4 a.m. would look. Thank you, readers, so much for joining. Please make sure and check out her Instagram for the latest news. She also has a newsletter you can sign up for if you would like to get more information that way. I'd like for everyone to subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you missed any part of this, you can always go back and watch it or find something new. I'm on Bookstagram and Facebook, and you can find out reviews and recommendations and more author chats there. We have lots of great authors getting scheduled coming up. Next Sunday, we have another debut author, Amanda Peters, for The Berry Pickers. This was a Barnes & Noble Discovery Pick winner and the winner of the Carnegie Prize of Excellence in Fiction. So a 4-year-old girl, a Native American girl, goes missing from the blueberry fields of Maine, sparking a mystery that will haunt the survivors, unravel a family, and remain unsolved for nearly 50 years. People magazine names it as a best new book, saying a stunning debut about love, race, brutality, and the balm of forgiveness. So if you haven't read it yet, you still have a week. Would love to have you join us. And again, Charmaine, this was a wonderful night and one I won't forget. So thank you so much. Lots of claps out there I saw already. And just thank you for this beautiful novel.
Thank you, and thanks for everything you do to bring writers and readers together.
Of course, my pleasure. Everybody have a
Bye-bye,
wonderful
everyone.
night, and I'll see y'all in a week. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.